Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
We ended up discussing how the war started. There are some details that do need further exploring. As one detail we didn't get into was how Durotan was exiled from the Horde by Gul'dan, and that this was done because it was felt that Durotan speaking out against the Fel was not something that could be tolerated, but on the other hand, Durotan was fairly popular in some circles of the Horde, and so Gul'dan feared just outright making a martyr of him, at least at first. That said, there was King Lane, who at first did not fully believe that the orcs could be a proper threat against all of Azeroth. That was before he started panicking and trying to call for aid from the other kingdoms. Lothar, though, was the first one to be convinced that they are that legitimate a threat. War soon rapidly escalated beyond the expectations of any character. The other detail that has to be highlighted is that the villages of Brightwood, Westfall, and the entire southern Red Ridge Mountains region fell, with most of the inhabitants either killed or forced to flee. So this is a huge chunk of territory that fell. That shows that this indeed was not the era of King Barathan. Now we get to Stormwind's first war efforts to push back the Horde. Starting off, Lothar was to give a loyal knight by the name of Gavinred the Dire command of a large contingent of troops, with many knights using Fabian tactics. You had, in turn, as mentioned, the Bleeding Hollow clan that had failed with the Gurubashi, and so you basically had the Horde, which had taken some pretty big hits. The war went on inconclusively, one can argue, for 3 whole years after the Dark Portal was first opened. That's where, but the Horde had learned from their mistakes and had begun to move so that, yes, the Fabian tactics of Anduin Lothar were causing problems for them, but the Horde had taken control of a good sizable chunk of territory and were threatening Stormwind, with the city starting to run out of supplies. So the tactic had kind of backfired a little. On the one hand, the Horde had lost a lot of their manpower, but on the other, they managed to turn it to their advantage. Aware of what was happening, Blackhand was to bring the Horde north to conquer the Red Ridge Mountains, and from there try to launch an attack on Stormwind. They met with very little resistance there, and came to believe that the humans would not attack until they reached the city, which was exactly what Anduin Lothar had tricked them into thinking. Lothar had kind of control over the situation, and this is where the situation soon kind of exploded in a way that neither side fully predicted. Blackhand was hoping to first claim Lakeshire. However, Lothar and his knights suddenly charged down the slopes, surrounded a great many of the orcs in a spectacular ambush. The trouble is that the Horde fought hard until most of their ranks were slaughtered. Lothar himself was to almost kill Blackhand, but 2 of the Shadow Council warlocks, pupils of Gul'dan, who had come along with Blackhand, were able to turn the tide of battle with their fell magic, and Lothar was forced to retreat. Blackhand was, of course, humiliated and was angry with the Shadow Council, and he was to weirdly kill his 2 rescuers, claiming they were incompetent. This served to anger Gul'dan, as there were his subordinates, and he had very few warlocks in his service. Blackhand, who was nothing more than a incompetent frontman, fell into this in a berserker rage. In a temper tantrum, slew 2 men who were invaluable. His boss, the real war chief, didn't take this too well. The Horde proved as inexorable as lava itself, flowing forward with thousands of their numbers marching through Elwyn Forest and thus encircling Stormwind, cutting off all access except for the sea. The Bleeding Hollow, despite their previous failures, were given a favorable position in the attack on Stormwind. That's not exactly wise, as they've proven themselves to be incompetent, but they're loyal to Blackhand, so I guess he's going to rely on them. Them and Twilight's Hammer clan was also called in, and they would use siege engines against Stormwind. Just as Stormwind seemed on the verge of falling, Lothar and the majority of Stormwind's knights moved to attack the Horde's rear lines. Now, they had cunningly decided to use a 2-pronged assault. Maneuvering themselves around the Horde by sea, they had used their advantage and mastery of the sea in a rather Roman style to transport their troops behind the enemy and to charge through Elwyn Forest, thus catching the orcs in the rear guard completely by surprise. The Bleeding Hollow and Twilight's Hammer clans try to push them back and fail, as the city guard outflank the orcs. They are forced to flee, and this is considered the greatest disaster in the war amongst the Horde, at least the war against Stormwind. Blackhand this time tempted to execute his 2 lackeys, but choosing not to, even though these guys were so incompetent that he probably should have executed them. But he feared that their clans might revolt. I think the problem is that his own legitimacy has been so destroyed by this time. He can't really do that because he's not a strong war chief. He has cost himself the support of Gul'dan due to stupidity, and now due to incompetency, he has led the Horde from one blunder after another. What makes things worse is that when the Horde withdraws near to Redridge, Lothar and King Lane end up managing to receive a lot of information from Khadgar, who had learnt of many of the plans of Gul'dan from Garona. Part of Stormwind's ability to figure out the plans of the Horde was that Garona, a half-orc, had fallen into the hands of King Lane and Anduin Lothar, and was helping work with Khadgar, whom she had become close to, organize a strategy against the Horde. Basically, she knew Gul'dan and Blackhand's plans, and rather than alter their plans and adapt to the situation, they had stuck to the very plans they had discussed in her presence before her capture, which is just the military incompetence here. It's beyond all words. Was probably the Horde's lowest point in the early part of the war. Blackhand was to then turn to Orgrim Doomhammer, his newest right-hand man, who, unlike his other men, was not incompetent. Orgrim was to build up several outposts, but as this isn't very interesting, let's jump back to bashing Blackhand. What makes matters even worse was that Blackhand's cruelty had so alienated some of the Horde that Griselda, Blackhand's own daughter, had decided to run off with Turok. Turok was an outlaw. He was the head of a rebellious group of ogres who had decided that they didn't really like Blackhand's way of leading, so Blackhand ordered all of them put to death, including his own daughter, which even for the Horde I think is a shocking act of cruelty, because that's your own blood. You can't just kill your own daughter.
And here we see Blackhand's usual MO. Launch failed attacks, devastated, retreat, blame everyone else for your problems, and slaughter those people.
But the worst part is that he can't inspire any loyalty. The fact that he had his own daughter put to death, I think, is a shocking act even to the orcs, who I don't think ever saw it coming. Now, some of the orcs did follow through with the deed, but on the other hand, there must have been those staring at this misdemeanor and going, why are we following this monster? He lacks all charisma, he lacks all strength, and all he has is rage and cruelty to fall back upon. The more he's losing the war, the crueler he's becoming, like all tyrants. Orgrim Doomhammer, for his part, is sent out because Blackhand wants to know more about human magic. He's sent out against the Sunny Glade in order to ravage it. Orgrim Doomhammer, of course, has orders not to destroy the Mage Tower because we don't want to lose the knowledge contained there. And for the first time in a while, there's a massive victory as Doomhammer smashes his way through the town, disperses the enemy army, and takes the place. Which you have to compare the utter failures and acts of cruelty by Blackhand in marked contrast with just runaway success of Doomhammer. So they could not be more different. It's at this time that Stormwind sends out emissaries to the orcs, hoping to negotiate, and the response from Blackhand and Gul'dan is to send back the messengers in pieces. A barbarous act, which breaks all conventions of warfare, as ambassadors have diplomatic immunity. Obviously, the Horde don't respect that. Stormwind turns to the Kirin Tor for help, with the Kirin Tor saying, well, this seems like a minor issue, more like a local disturbance, not something to get too worried about. It just goes to show that the Kirin Tor had fallen into complacency. But that said, the orcish encampments near Sunnyglade were ravaged and pushed back, with the people of Sunnyglade having to try to rebuild Sunnyglade. So in that regard, Anduin Lothar was able to push back against Doomhammer. But the problem is, Doomhammer had already spread the knowledge of magic throughout his ranks, so that the orcs had learnt a great deal in the months that passed between their conquest of Sunnyglade and their loss of the region. With magic in hand, they were able to begin the conquest of Stormwind for reals. They would do so not under the command of Blackhand and his incompetent lackeys, but under the real command of the brilliant and inexorable Orgrim Doomhammer. Thoughts on this part of the war?
It's obvious who one should follow. Leading through terror and leading through example. You see the two different... The problem with leading through terror if there's someone stronger than that person,
people are just going to go switch over their loyalties to him. Lothar and Lane are more than capable of dealing with Blackhand. It's really Blackhand and Gul'dan that has everyone going, this is a local disturbance, nothing more. The local cops can deal with this. Why get other countries and whatnot involved in this when clearly you have it in hand? Which, there's a valid argument to be made there. There's just one wild factor. Doomhammer. The thing about Doomhammer is that he's a very peculiar character. You should almost compare him to Julius Caesar in a way, in that he's making Veni Vidi Vici with him. He came, he saw, he conquered. You really cannot compare Thrall to a Doomhammer, as Thrall never is the kind of war chief and leader that Doomhammer is. Thrall, in a lot of ways, for all his magical capabilities, is a military dunce compared to the brilliant Doomhammer. What's more is that Doomhammer, while he does lose Sunnyglade, what does it actually achieve for Stormwind? Nothing. Anduin Lothar is not a match for Doomhammer as a general here. He's so much more than what anyone can deal with. Between his brilliant takeover by storm of Sunnyglade, his incredible accomplishments of just doing everything Blackhand tries, even better, and the fact that he turns losses into victories, he's really something that Stormwind has never fought against before in their entire existence as a country. It's really a case where they've more than met their match in this barbarian orc. How could they possibly know how to fight him if they don't even know who he is? Because they don't yet know everything about him. So you have, at this point in the war, much as it probably briefly looks like Stormwind could seize the day, they can't. And they just don't know it yet. Because the next part of the war will see the city fall.
in my opinion, Doomhammer is probably the only reason why Stormwind fell.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for him,
Well, we'll get to that next time. He's also probably the best leader the Horde ever had. Let's just be honest. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Doomhammer taking down Blackhand.